Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to an episode of Under the Macroscope, Skybound Capital's weekly podcast. And wonderful to have back with us today Skybound's Chief Investment Officer sitting in Hong Kong, Theodore Xu. Theo, we're going to drill down into a very interesting topic during the course of this podcast, and that is going to be centered around electric vehicles, their growth, their potential future development, and some of the impacts around the industry. But we've chosen this topic because this week we have seen COP26 in Glasgow, the coming together of world leaders, most of the world leaders, around the very sensitive topic of climate change and the need for immediate change in behavior, change in action. And what I want to start with is your comment. We always get different perspectives, important different perspectives from you when it comes to China and China's attitude to macro topics. And China received some harsh criticism, and most notably and vocally from Joe Biden this week for their lack of presence in Glasgow. I'm interested to get your take on that up front. What does it mean, if anything?
Sure. First of all, COP26 is not in news headlines in China. I think most of the Chinese are not following that very closely, although the awareness definitely is there. Many Chinese are a lot more pragmatic than what people usually think they are. And when it comes to these meetings, I think two interesting points. One is that the Chinese leaders, particularly the chairman of the party or the president, has not been outside of the country in the past 2 years. He was active in all sorts of global events and meetings, but he attended all those meetings virtually. So he hasn't really been physically flying to anywhere for meetings. I think that was more a COVID concern. And secondly, back to my point on being pragmatic, we have also seen a lot of criticism on the world leaders who are flying to Glasgow in private jets, or maybe too many private jets. I think for the Chinese, they do not want to put on a show just for the sake of a show. China has its own agendas on zero emission, on climate change, on carbon neutrality, and it is sincere. The thing is, when China put up those targets, usually it is targets set for itself. Yes, it wants to showcase to the rest of the world that, okay, these are our targets, but that's less of a concern to the Chinese. The Chinese cares more about, okay, now we have the targets, how exactly will we be able to achieve those targets? Some of the targets might seem pretty remote. Okay, that's for 2030, that's for 2050. But if you know the track record of Chinese and Chinese policymakers, normally they stay ahead of the game. Normally they try to achieve targets before the deadlines. Whereas in some of the other markets, we see deadlines can be postponed and postponed. So when I say the Chinese are sincere, we can see evidence across the board, across different sectors, when it comes to like achieving carbon neutrality, and when it comes to applying more renewable energy. If we look at the power generation in China, for example, in the past 5 years, the percentage or the weight of renewable energy actually more than doubled. And given the size, that's a lot. I mean, basically, China is generating a lot more energy through renewable ways than many countries in their entire year. And so I think China is definitely trying to focus a lot on domestic issues, but unfortunately, when it comes to climate change, domestic issues are always global issues, right? Whatever you do in China actually will have an impact on the rest of the world. And in that regard, I would say, yeah, focusing on your own affairs maybe is the best thing for the rest of the world comparing to flying to Glasgow.
Yeah, well, notwithstanding China's absence in Glasgow, there were a lot of commitments made by other world leaders. And if you'll excuse the expression, time will tell if it was all hot air. And I think
Exactly.
there is going to be a lot of uh, investigation in the media. I think this has become a hot media topic as well. And leaders are going to be held to account, I suspect, more than they ever have been in the past, given some of the very bold statements that have been made in Glasgow. But now COP26 coincided with the announcement that Elon Musk, at least for now, has become the world's richest individual. That in itself means, as founder of Tesla, that electric vehicles have really become a major topic. So I'd like you to just delve into that a little bit for us, Theo, and talk about the electric vehicle market globally as we see it today.
Sure. And I like the fact that you accidentally mentioned electronic, because I think EVs today are going to be more and more like electronic devices that people are getting used to nowadays. They're still carrying the features of being a vehicle, but at the same time, they're, as I said, more like an electronic device. Electric vehicles are not new. Roughly 150 years ago, the first man-made car was actually an electric vehicle. And it was an electric car. And in the subsequent 20 years, electric cars were a lot more than internal combustion engine cars. EVs were the majority over a century ago. But if we look at today, we are selling roughly 90 to 100 million cars a year in the world. And out of that 100 million cars, 2.6 million cars were sold in the first half of this year. So let's double that. That means about 5 million cars a year this year. So EVs will be 5% of the total global sales of cars. So that's the market. But what's interesting though, is that global car sales have been on the decline in recent years, pretty much year after year, whereas EV sales was surely growing very fast. So take this year, for example, we are going to more than double the sales of we're going to see more than double the sales of EVs in the world. And that kind of growth has been sustaining for quite a few years already. So that was the overall market. But now let's look at the major players who are selling more cars, who are selling more EVs, and who are the main buyers. So if we look at the overall EV buyers and markets, China is undoubtedly the single largest market. China has roughly 40% of the market share in terms of, I guess, both the output as well as the consumption. And the second and the third largest markets are Germany and US, both of which is roughly a quarter the size of China when it comes to EV. So yes, they are the second and the third largest, but they are much smaller compared to the largest. And if we look at, well, we talked about Elon Musk, Tesla also sells roughly a quarter of its cars in China alone. So China is definitely a key market that we need to look at. And this circles back to our opening discussion around zero emission, around how to contribute to climate change. I guess China is doing things in its own way, and China is trying to pacing itself. But that doesn't mean China doesn't have the commitment to that course. In fact, China is probably committing a lot more in practice than many other countries. China is not pumping the hot air per se. And if we look at the overall market share of EVs in China, I mentioned that global sales, EV is roughly 5% of overall car sales. Whereas in China, I think this year we are going to see possibly 7 to 8% of car sales being EVs, but that percentage is going to increase significantly faster. Or let me give you the numbers. China is going to sell 2.5 million cars, EVs, this year, which will be half of the global EV sales. In the next 3 years, China is targeting to sell 10 million EVs just within China. So that's quadrupling what it is selling today. And the total car sales will not grow much at all in China. That means the weight of EV will also grow from roughly 7-8% today to about 30% in the very, very near future. So that is how China is handling the whole issue. But I guess we will definitely see a lot of challenges, and many people will question whether even EVs are actually helping zero emission.
Yeah, I would love to come back to that question to close off, or that discussion. But with this growth trajectory, we've seen new brands of EVs emerging. We've seen some IPOs in recent months. From an investment perspective, are you perceiving continued and indeed growing interest in the sector?
Oh, for sure. I think no matter whether it is out of sincere interest or simply greenwashing from some of the managers, the investor interest will sustain in not only EV, but the overall clean energy, the overall idea or theme. And EV is the most reachable sector in the sense that you can literally see the cars on the street, you can touch and feel them. And therefore, for an average investor, they can relate to the EVs. Many of them probably are driving an EV already. This is why we see continued interest into EVs. However, we're less so optimistic on the OEM manufacturers or on the car makers per se. There will definitely be a lot of brands coming out of the market or different parts of the world in the following years to come. But if we look at the conventional car market, how many real heavyweight players are there after years or decades of competition? I mean, yes, even take UK, for example, where you are in right now. UK used to be home to many car brands, but now you can't even argue there's zero homegrown UK brand anymore. That's the reality. This is a high capex and highly technical sector, no matter whether it is a combustion engine or EV. So the competition will gradually get more and more fierce. The number of, or I should say, the large number of players coming into the market is fueling the prosperity of the sector. However, many of them will gradually fall behind. And in the next 10, 20 years, we will also witness the demise of many of these brands and makers. So, and the leaders of today, I'm not referring to a specific brand, but let's say the top 5 might not stay in top 5 in just a few years' time. Therefore, we are seeing more and more investment opportunities that are possibly related to the sector, but not necessarily car makers themselves. And I would like to go even beyond the sector. Okay, we talked about EVs, but the thing is, nowadays cars are getting more and more smart, even for the conventional gas cars. So again, that circles back to your point on electronic. Any car today are using more electronic components and becoming more of an electronic device. And we've also seen technological advancement in autonomous driving. That kind of technology doesn't have to be used in EVs only. It can actually be applied to any car. Therefore, we are seeing a lot of interesting investment opportunities within the automobile industry, but not necessarily just to EVs. Yeah. Even if we are only looking at EVs, there might be other suppliers or downstream players who are likely to benefit more from the burgeoning EV industry. For example, semiconductor suppliers. I mean, there are only a few monopoly players in that market, and that landscape is not going to change anytime soon. They will benefit significantly from all these new brands and new players who are looking for a bigger market share. They don't care. I mean, whoever comes into the market, we supply them with goods, and they will have to buy from us anyway. So that's what I'm saying. There will be many, many other players or companies that will also benefit from this big trend, but it doesn't have to be the EV car makers.
So Theo, to circle back to a comment you made, and just by way of closing here, you've mentioned some of the challenges for the conventional players and the barriers to entry for potential new players. Those are certainly macro challenges for the industry. But just to circle back to your comment on, is it really contributing to zero emissions? Let's be clear. A very obvious statement, but an important one, is an electric vehicle needs to be charged. So the production of electricity in order to charge those vehicles is an additional factor that has to be taken into account. And while we are hearing from COP26 and a variety of leaders, we have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels in order to effect a reversal, if that's possible, of climate change. We are dependent in this sector on the production of electricity. So is the EV sector genuinely contributing to zero emission policy?
I think so far it is a gesture of goodwill. Whoever is buying an EV or trying to promote electric vehicle, I'm sure most of them have this idea or this target that they can be contributing to zero emission. But practically, I personally do not think EVs are that much a contributor as many makers might claim. Even if we look at the car industry, the chairman of Toyota claimed in public that he doesn't buy that story. He does truly believe that if we look at the entire life cycle of that car, most likely EVs are not necessarily contributing much to zero emission. And I think there are many reasons. You mentioned one, the generational power itself, but there are others. For example, EVs usually are much heavier than the same car if it is a combustion engine, because you carry a huge battery pack. And for whoever learned the basics of physics, it has to take power to drive something, right? And so if it is heavier, that consumes more energy. I don't care whether you generate that energy from burning coal or solar power, but it is more energy. So the consumption of more energy itself is kind of not so green, right? And the other thing is we have also seen that EV people tend to be driving EV for shorter life cycles, or I should say the longevity of EVs so far that we have seen tend to be shorter than a conventional car. I mean, we've seen people drive a Beetles for 3-4 decades and they can still run. But when it comes to EVs, I think more and more people are treating them like your smartphone. They are trying to recycle them. They're going to replace their EVs at a quicker pace than a conventional car. And if we are seeing more and more waste during that process, again, that is not necessarily contributing to a greener world. But that calls for, I believe, technological innovation. I mentioned the weight. What if someone can come up with a tech that builds these battery into much lighter weight? What if we can find easier ways to charge these cars with renewable energy? What if we can make them more durable as a vehicle itself? So I think this circles back to my point on finding investment opportunities. It doesn't have to be a particular car maker. It could be anyone who come up with a tech. And the most I guess the immediately upcoming one is higher voltage. Because in the past few years, we've been seeing EV expand their voltage from, let's say, 100V to 200V to 400V. And now, really, later this year, we are going to see cars carrying 800V. And what does that mean? Theoretically, that means you can charge to full capacity within 10 minutes. That will make EVs almost on par with driving into a gas station and wait for your gas tank to be pumped. And all these changes will make EVs more accessible, more usable.
Yep. So it's a sector that is very much on the radar, but with still a lot of progress to be made. As always, Theo, when we address topics with you, we seem to find things that are really interesting to keep a close eye on. And I suppose this week, with the conference held up in Glasgow, it's brought it into sharper focus. So thanks as always for your insights. Don't forget that you can download Under the Macroscope at Apple, Spotify, and the Google Podcast platform for Android, and all past editions of the podcast are available at www.skyboundcapital.com. Until next time on Under the Macroscope, have a great week, everyone.